Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're not just looking at a list of laws, we are unraveling a massive, profound societal mystery. Think of this as Act 1 of our story, the architecture of oppression. We're going to explore how legal systems have historically controlled human identity and how some truly brilliant minds and brave advocates have thought to tear those structures down. I mean, we're looking at the very foundation of who we are and how society actually dictates who we're allowed to be. It's fascinating and it's absolutely crucial.
We're starting with this incredibly powerful idea that the rigid categories we just accept as completely natural might actually be a script we're all being forced to perform. Look at this quote from feminist philosopher Judith Butler. It totally shatters the illusion of biological destiny. She's saying, think about it not as biology, but as a mandatory societal performance. From the literal moment we're born, we're handed a script based on our anatomy, and we are expected to act it out flawlessly. But you have to ask yourself, what happens to the people who refuse to read that script?
Well, that brings us here. What's really interesting about this breakdown is how it maps out the spectrum of oppression. It proves that the most dangerous discrimination out there is often brilliantly disguised as a totally neutral policy. So beyond direct discrimination, like blatantly refusing to hire someone based on their gender, we have indirect and structural discrimination. These are the invisible tripwires. Think about an inheritance law that quietly favors male heirs, or maybe a physical strength test designed entirely around a male body standard. These are the bricks and mortar of the architecture of oppression. It's a systemic matrix operating completely silently in the background of our everyday lives, and it particularly punishes folks who sit at the intersections of marginalized identities.
Looking closely at these mechanisms, we see how heteronormativity functions exactly like that systemic matrix, essentially pathologizing anyone who deviates from the script. And this isn't just about individual prejudice. As the theorist Michel Foucault pointed out, power structures actively use our institutions, from the courts right down to the church, to regulate our bodies and force everyone into a single, tightly controlled box. Society assumes heterosexuality is the absolute, unquestionable norm, and then it literally weaponizes everyday institutions to systematically push out anyone who doesn't fit.
Okay, let's move to Act 2, the illusion of the binary. Let's see how this all builds. Brilliant minds started to realize that identity isn't just biology, it's a social construct molded by the people in power. We've got a stark comparison to look at here: essentialism versus social constructionism. The essentialist view says, hey, you're born a certain way, your identity is biologically locked in. But the social constructionists, they look a lot deeper. They argue that categories of sexual identity are actually produced through culture, history, and power dynamics. Actually, here's a wild fact for you. The very concept of a homosexual as a distinct category of person didn't even exist until 19th century medical systems invented it to control human behavior. Crazy, right?
So the crucial takeaway here is that society actively polices our performances. It makes heterosexuality and the gender binary appear natural simply because they are compulsory. Like Butler was saying, we see gender as an act, a script we are forced to read over and over again until it feels innate. And if you disrupt that performance, whether that's through drag or transgender identity or queer expression, you expose the massive secret that the original binary never truly existed in the first place. You cause gender trouble, and let me tell you, that absolutely terrifies the architects of the status quo.
And these aren't just abstract ideas. Think of these theories as intellectual sledgehammers. Theorists like Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick argued that the closet isn't just a hiding place, it's an active structure of oppression designed specifically to keep people isolated. Adrian Rich added to this, saying that heterosexuality isn't just a norm, it's compulsory, meaning it's enforced to maintain a patriarchal order. These theories completely deconstructed our reality. They showed us that societal ignorance isn't an accident, it's a deliberate, calculated tool used to maintain power.
But you know, theory never exists in a vacuum. So let's shift to Act 3 of our story, the global and local battlegrounds. Take a look at this number, 68. Today, a sobering 68 countries around the world still criminalize homosexuality. In these 68 nations, that architecture of oppression we've been talking about is written directly into the penal code. And a lot of the time, they're using copy-pasted, archaic Victorian laws left behind by colonizers long after they packed up and went home. The simple act of loving who you love, or just being who you are, literally makes you a criminal in the eyes of the state.
And this, brilliantly and terrifyingly, illustrates the life or death stakes. 11. In 11 of those countries, expressing your true identity carries the death penalty. It's a stark, horrific reminder of how far institutional homophobia can go. The legal system, which is supposed to protect citizens, is instead being used as the ultimate weapon of eradication. We have to understand these numbers, not just as data points on a screen, but as actual human lives hanging in the balance, fighting every single day against state-sponsored violence.
We really have to anchor these concepts in human reality. We're talking about minority stress and the devastating lived consequences of it. Everything from family rejection to corrective rape. When the law constantly tells a young person they are an outcast, it forces homelessness and skyrocketing psychological distress. This is literally a public health crisis. The mental and physical health consequences are the direct, tangible result of a society that systematically denies an entire group of people their basic humanity.
So, shifting back to the international stage, how do we fight back? Well, the Yogyakarta Principles provided a massive lifeline. Established by human rights experts in 2006 and then expanded in 2017, these principles were a total game changer. They demanded bodily integrity and state protection. And the genius of it is, they didn't try to invent new rights. They just boldly articulated how existing, universally agreed upon human rights apply to sexual orientation and gender identity. They finally gave advocates worldwide the exact vocabulary and legal framework they needed to demand their right to exist, totally free from violence and criminalization.
Which brings us to Act 4, the fall of 377 and the unfinished revolution. This timeline captures the cinematic, agonizing legal ping-pong in the Indian courts. It's a century-long fight to dismantle a single oppressive British colonial law, Section 377, that criminalized anything deemed against the order of nature. Just look at the dramatic swings here. Decriminalized in 2009 by the High Court, then tragically recriminalized by the Supreme Court in 2013, before finally decisively being struck down in 2018. It is an unbelievable story of sheer resilience.
When the Constitutional Bench finally struck down Section 377 in 2018, it wasn't just a legal victory. It was a monumental reclamation of human dignity. The Nabte Singh Johar case didn't just decriminalize an act. It forcefully affirmed that LGBTQI+ individuals absolutely deserve equality and protection. It actually acknowledged historical wrongs. It was this profound cinematic moment of transformation where the highest court in the land finally looked at the queer community and said, "You belong, and your identity is fundamentally protected."
But actually, preceding that victory was the breathtaking NALSA judgment. Often called India's Yogyakarta, this 2014 judgment essentially tore down the patriarchal binary embedded in law. It recognized transgender people as a third gender and crucially upheld the right to self-perceived gender identity. It legally recognized deeply rooted communities like the Hijras, who have literally existed on the margins for centuries, and ordered the government to step up and provide social and economic support. It was an incredible beacon of hope. Yet, as we enter the final act of this explainer, this shocking number reveals the reality of our unfinished revolution: 90. Despite the soaring legal poetry of that NALSA judgment, the reality on the ground is still deeply fractured. Over 90% of transgender persons face total economic exclusion. Think about that. 90% of a population pushed entirely out of the formal economy, denied jobs, education, housing. It forces so many into informal, often criminalized means of survival. It's proof that a favorable court ruling doesn't just magically erase centuries of structural discrimination. And that brings us to the Transgender Persons Act of 2019. Now, this was supposed to be the statutory realization of the NALSA judgment, right? The big win in writing. But critics argue it simultaneously constructed entirely new bureaucratic prisons. Instead of allowing for true self-identification, it requires transgender individuals to apply to a government official, a district magistrate, just to validate their existence. It basically replaced the liberation of self-identity with the cold, unfeeling machinery of state bureaucracy.
Let's break down these critical flaws. The act totally failed to provide the crucial affirmative action needed to pull the community out of that 90% economic exclusion rate we just talked about. And honestly, even worse, it criminalized begging. Now, begging is a traditional livelihood for many in the Hydro community, so the law effectively punishes them for the very poverty that society forced upon them in the first place. It is a tragic irony that a law meant for liberation ended up criminalizing the exact survival mechanisms these marginalized communities rely on to stay alive.
So, I want to leave you with this provocative thought as we wrap up. When the ink dries on decriminalization, how do we dismantle the invisible prisons of societal inequality? Striking down an unjust law is huge, yes, but it's only the first step in a much longer, deeply profound battle for true equality. We've traced this architecture of oppression from its theoretical roots all the way to modern courtrooms. We've seen the landmark victories, but as long as these structural inequalities persist, the revolution remains unfinished. The laws might change, but the society that enforces them has to transform right along with them. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the scripts you're handed.